The wind rose from Lake St. Matthew, carrying the scent of cold metal and old mist. Clara Ruiz, a single mother from Mexico, thought she'd only bought a cheap, abandoned in a new beginning after too much loss. But the past never rests. On the 10th night, the steel door beneath the staircase burst open, and a rush of icy air poured out like the sigh of time itself. Behind it lay a cellar sealed since 1946, a place hiding a truth that would force an entire town to face itself. When justice lies buried beneath your floorboards, would you dare open it? The Holocaust Museum in Washington sent a letter of thanks. A Jewish organization in New York raised nearly $200,000 to help restore the St. Matthew Inn into a memorial museum. But what moved Clara most wasn't the money. It was a handwritten letter from a woman in Montreal. "My name is Ruth Goldstein Mayer. I believe one of the children in the footage is me. I still remember the face of the soldier who lifted me onto the ship, and the word mercy on the wooden crate." A week later, Ruth arrived, an 85-year-old woman, silver-haired, hands trembling, still clutching an old photograph taken beside a piano. Clara immediately recognized her, the girl from the Children from Krakow photo. Ruth entered the lobby, tears spilling as she looked around the old inn. "I remember this cellar," she said. "The sound of waves outside and the smell of machine oil. That night they fired flares. I heard bombs and then someone covered my head. That someone was Captain Dalton." She wept. Clara embraced her as if holding the past itself. No one spoke, only the soft, steady sound of rain on the eaves. News spread across the United States. Descendants of the rescued children came searching. They brought photos, letters, keepsakes like pieces of scattered souls finding one another again. A group of students from Columbia University came to film a documentary. Reporters from NBC and CNN poured into the little town that had once been forgotten. Clara organized a community meeting in the newly cleared lobby, warm lights glowing and small candles set along the hallway. The room filled up, faces that had once doubted her now looked at her respectfully. Evelyn stepped forward and said, "Today we're not just restoring a building, we're restoring the honor of people who dared to do what was right in the darkest of times." Ruth walked up to Clara and took her hand. "Do you know, if Captain Dalton hadn't chosen mercy that night, I wouldn't be alive, and if you chose silence today, this story would have died a second time." Clara didn't answer, she only bowed her head. Inside, she felt it clearly: sometimes justice doesn't need a courtroom, it needs the courage to speak. After everyone had left that evening, she put away the last chairs. On the table, someone had left a photograph of Captain Dalton with a scrawled note: "Mercy never truly ends." Candlelight flickered across Clara's face. She felt truly light for the first time in years, as if the winter wind had finally stopped blowing through the old inn. 2 years later, the St. Matthew Inn was no longer the abandoned house. It had become the Mercy Memory and Community Center, supported by the state of Maine and the Federal Historical Foundation. The old rooms were now classrooms, archives, and exhibition spaces about Operation Mercy. On the walls hung photographs of the rescued children and of the soldier who vanished that night in 1946, Captain Dalton. Leo, now 10, ran through the hallways, proudly showing visitors the spot where Mom found the secret cellar. He often told them, "Mom says doing the right thing is like building a house. It takes time, patience, and sometimes you have to feel the cold a little." Clara was arranging the display room one late autumn afternoon when a middle-aged man walked in. He was dressed simply, a backpack slung over one shoulder, gray in his hair. When he saw Dalton's photograph, he stopped for a long time. Clara approached. "You knew him?" The man nodded, his voice thick. "I'm David Dalton, his grandson." The air grew still. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. "My grandfather left this in an old chest. He wrote about a woman who would one day uncover the truth for him. I didn't believe it until I read about you." Clara smiled, eyes shining with tears. Maybe he never really left this place. He was just waiting for someone brave enough to open the door. They stepped out onto the porch together. The wind from Lake St. Matthew blew again, this time warmer, clearer. In the distance, maple leaves drifted slowly down, painting the path in gold. Leo ran up, took his mother's hand, and asked, "Mom, why do people come here so much?" Clara bent down and smiled softly. "Because everyone needs to remember that justice isn't something we're given, it's something we protect." David looked at them and nodded gently. "My grandfather once wrote, 'Mercy isn't a moment, it's a legacy.' Now I understand." As dusk settled, church bells rang from the hill. Inside the lobby, golden light streamed through the old window frames. The wall where the 1943 film had once been projected was now covered with children's drawings, dreams, houses, and scrawled words. "Be kind, be brave." Clara stood still, her hand resting on the wall, feeling the warmth spread through it. She knew that compassion allowed people to endure no matter how long the time had passed. Outside, the wind carried the scent of the lake and damp wood into the room. A circle had closed from fear to truth, healing loss. Clara Ruiz, the mother who once bought a rundown inn to find shelter, was now the keeper of light for an entire town. And there, in the whisper of the late autumn wind, justice was no longer buried, it had become faith itself. The first winter morning in the lakeside town of St. Matthew was so cold that every breath turned to frost. Clara Ruiz's old pickup rolled slowly down a road carpeted with fallen leaves. 8-year-old Leo curled inside his jacket, staring through the fogged-up window. The inn came into view, peeling paint, leaking roof, broken windows, and a tilted sign that still showed a few faint letters. St. Matthew Inn, rest for the weary traveler. She murmured the words, then gave a tired smile. For the weary maybe that really is written for me. Clara worked 2 shifts a day for 3 years at the garment factory. She'd come from Mexico, a legal immigrant, her English still halting, her head always bowed in conversation. All she had was $4,200 savings and a small loan from a friend at the shop, just enough to buy the abandoned building. What do you think, Leo? It looks kinda scary, Mom. It's not, said, taking his hand. It's just a place nobody's cleaned yet. The heavy wooden door groaned open, a damp, musty smell mixed with old paint and rust swept out. They stepped inside. Suddenly, a loose window pane dropped and shattered. Leo screamed, pressing against his mother. Clara pulled him close. It's okay, baby, just the wind. They walked down the hall. Beneath the thick dust, the floorboards were solid. The steel beams still held firm. In the wreckage, Clara saw a structure as stubborn as her resolve. That first night, they spread their only blanket on the floor of a small room, no electricity, no heat. Leo slept soundly in her arms while Clara lay awake, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the wall. In the dark, she pulled out a crumpled sheet of paper and wrote a list. Day 1, clean the lobby. Day 2, fix the bathroom. Day 3, seal the windows. Day 4, don't give up. The handwriting was shaky, tired, trembling from the cold. She taped the note to the wall and looked at it like a vow. The next morning, she truly began. She spent days at the factory and nights cleaning, teaching herself plumbing and wiring through YouTube tutorials. Locals passed by, shaking their heads. No one can save that place, Clara. She just smiled, saying nothing. Because they didn't know to someone who'd lost everything. Even a broken roof can feel like hope. But while sweeping the staircase, a chill brushed her ankle. Clara looked down. A narrow crack between 2 steps, exhaling cold air with a metallic scent. She shivered. Probably a rat, she told herself. Yet the draft, faint as it was, felt like someone whispering from beneath the floor. The first days passed slowly like winter wind. By day, Clara worked at the sewing shop. By night, she removed her uniform, pulled on an old jacket, and started cleaning again. Leo did his homework in the lobby, sometimes reading aloud under the flashlight beam. They called it our project house. From YouTube tutorials, Clara learned everything from her phone pipes, wiring, and even how to patch floorboards. See, kiddo, she said, screwdriver in hand, if they can do it, so can we. Leo grinned, then I'm your helper. After a week, they finally cleared the main lobby. Beneath the peeling paint, faded ivory walls emerged. She wiped the tilted sign on the wall, revealing the weathered words, St. Matthew Inn, rest for the weary traveler. She read it softly and murmured, a rest for the weary, guess there's a reason it's still standing. That afternoon, Clara brought some bread to the library, hoping to find old records about the building. The elderly librarian, Mr. Harlan, pushed his glasses down and studied her. You're the woman who bought that place? Yes, I just want to learn a little of its history. He hesitated, then spoke quietly. I used to work security there. One night in 1946, I heard a scream. A soldier ran from the basement yelling, don't close the door. By morning, the cellar was welded shut. Nobody ever spoke of it again. A week later, he disappeared. A chill crept up Clara's spine. Do you know why? He shook his head. No one dared to ask. The police said it was military business. After that, folks stayed away. When she got home, night had fallen. Leo was asleep. Clara stood by the staircase where the cold draft rose from the crack. She knelt and shone her flashlight. The gap was wider than before, as if the floorboards were slowly pulling apart. She leaned closer and breathed in. Cold, dry, metallic, not the smell of rats or mildew. She grabbed a hammer, ready to seal it, then stopped. Her heart pounded like when she was a little girl hearing ghost stories back in her village. It's just an old house, she whispered, forcing a smile, but Mr. Harlan's voice echoed in her mind. Don't close the door. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay there listening to the wind hiss up the stairs, the wood creaking like footsteps. In the morning, she found her note had fallen to the floor. The 4 lines were still there, but day 4, don't give up, was smudged as if touched by a cold hand. She looked up toward the staircase where dim light fell through the old crack, and for the first time, Clara whispered, what's down there? For 3 nights, Clara didn't sleep soundly. The wind from the staircase grew louder, like someone tapping gently on the wooden floor. By the 4th night, she decided she wouldn't run anymore. After dropping Leo at school, she returned with a flashlight, a hammer, and an old knife. She stood before the stairs, staring at the crack now as wide as her palm, cold, metallic, and silent. She bent down and began prying up the boards. A sharp crack echoed the sound of nails and rotten wood twisting after almost 80 years. It sounded like breaking bones. Clara paused, then struck again. Each blow was a fight with her own fear. When the gap was wide enough, she shone the light down. A narrow stairway appeared, thick with dust and cobwebs. The air below was heavy and stale, smelling of rust and damp stone. She wrapped a scarf over her mouth and descended. Her flashlight beam wavered through the gloom. No rats, no trash, only rows of wooden crates stacked neatly. Faded markings read, U.S. Supply Corps 1943. A map of Europe was hung on one wall, and the section over Poland was circled in red. Her heartbeat quickened. She opened a chest. Inside were old film reels labeled Operation Mercy 1943. A small envelope slipped out. Inside was a black and white photo. 5 children in wool sweaters standing in the snow, thin smiles, strangely solemn eyes. On the back, written in English, "Children from Krakow safe now." Clara sank to the floor. The musty air burned her throat as she coughed. No one had opened this cellar since 1946, that much was clear. But why were there war films and photos here? Part of her wanted to close the lid and pretend she'd seen nothing. But she looked again at the children's faces. Their expressions reminded her of Leo. She remembered her promise, "I'll never lie to you." If the truth had been buried, she would be the one to uncover it. Clara carried the box upstairs. A faint handprint remained on the lid, as if someone had once held it with a blood-wet hand. She shivered but didn't stop. That night after Leo was asleep, she cleaned the dust from an old projector in the corner of the cellar. She plugged in the cord and impossibly the bulb flickered to life. Across the stained wall, the first images appeared. A group of American soldiers is loading children onto a train. The wind outside howled through the cracks like the sigh of the past. Clara murmured, "If this is real, someone was trying to save them." She didn't know that the truth waiting to be seen in the remaining reels would soon force the entire town to face its own history. The projector's light flickered, trembling as it swept across the stained wall. Clara sat motionless, holding her breath. The footage was old and brittle, yet clear enough to show soldiers carrying children, cold, hungry, clinging to one another. A man's voice crackled faintly through the recording, as if pulled through 70 years of dust and silence. Operation Mercy, evacuation successful. The name Captain Dalton appeared at the end of the frame, handwritten. Clara recognized the script. It matched the faded signature carved into the wooden plaque in the lobby. She recorded everything on her phone. Each time she slowed the reel, the film clicking mixed with another sound, soft sobbing. At first, she thought it came from the tape itself, but when she muted the audio, the crying remained faint, distant. Rising from beneath the floor, Clara clenched her hands, trying to steady herself. She fast-forwarded to the final scene, a short clip. Captain Dalton stood in the same cellar she had just discovered. On the table sat a wooden chest identical to the one she'd opened. He babbled, his tone urgent. "If anyone finds this, don't let them take it back. The children must be remembered." Then came pounding on the door a shout, half American, half German. "Dalton, open up!" The camera shook violently. The frame jolted, freezing on his hand, covering the lens. Behind him, a red streak splattered across the wall. The screen turned white, leaving only the low hum of spinning film. Clara sat frozen. She rewound and paused on the final image. Across the wall, within the burned-out glare of the last frame, words appeared scrawled in what looked like dried blood. "Mercy ends where silence begins." She shuddered. The room remained dark, except for the faint projector light casting long shadows behind her. As if someone were standing there, she spun around. Nothing, only the wind outside and tattered curtains fluttering in the draft. Clara lifted her phone, hands trembling, re-recording everything. "Someone has to understand this," she whispered. Then she thought of Leo and a chill filled her chest. If this were military evidence, someone had been hiding it for 80 years. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Stop digging, you don't know what you're opening." Clara looked around, empty. She deleted the message, locked every door, and stored the reels inside the metal cabinet. But that night, when Leo called for her from the next room, she clearly heard, between the gusts of wind, the sound of a child crying rising from the cellar. 2 days later, rain poured over St. Matthew like a broken dam. Cold drops hammered the tin roof, steady and impatient, as if someone were knocking from above. Clara sat at the kitchen table, staring at the email she had just written. "To Historical Archives of Maine, found WWII footage possibly linked to Operation Mercy." She reread it, her hands shaking, then pressed send. Leo was coloring in the lobby. "Stay inside, okay? It's coming down hard." He nodded, eyes bright at her concern. "I'm not scared, Mom." Clara smiled faintly, though her chest felt heavy. That night, as she switched off the lights, headlights flashed across her window. A black car had stopped in the rain. A man stood outside, motionless, with no umbrella. He looked up toward her room, then vanished into the storm. The next morning at the market, Clara found a man waiting beside her truck. Tall, dark coat, calm voice. "Ms. Ruiz?" "Yes, my name's Nathan Cole. I represent a private consortium dealing with historical assets. You have something you shouldn't." Clara frowned. "What do you mean?" "The reels you found, they belong to a chapter of history better left untouched. Certain families in Maine are involved and they don't want that past reopened." She tried to keep her voice steady. "I've already sent copies to the state archives. They'll know how to handle them legally." Nathan's eyes hardened. "The archives? You think they'll protect you? You have no idea who you're up against." He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a blank check. "Stay quiet and I'll see this place restored. Your son can attend any school you choose." Clara looked at the check, then at him. "You know," she said quietly, "I've spent my life bowing my head just to survive, but I'm not teaching my son to bow his head to silence." Nathan gave a thin smile. "Then you'll regret it." He turned and disappeared into the rain. That night, Clara locked every door. The wind howled, the curtains billowed. Her phone buzzed again and again, unknown numbers. Each message said only, "Stop before it's too late." She didn't sleep. Instead of fear, she opened her laptop, recorded every file and uploaded it to a secure drive at the archives. A line appeared on the screen. File uploaded successfully. Evelyn Hart, Senior Researcher, Holocaust Studies Division. Clara exhaled, closed her eyes and whispered, "If they want to hide it, then I'll be the one to make it seen." Thunder rolled outside. Lightning flashed across the window, and for a split second, a man's face reflected behind her. 2 days after the meeting with Nathan Cole, Clara received a call from an unknown number. An older woman's voice came through, clear and steady. "Are you Clara Ruiz? I'm Evelyn Hart, head of Holocaust Studies at the archives. I watched the video you sent. Do you have time to meet me?" Clara was silent for a few seconds, then answered, "How soon do you need?" "Tonight's train. I'll come to St. Matthew." That evening, the rain still fell. Evelyn stepped off the platform in a gray coat, her silver hair pinned neatly back. Her eyes weren't those of a stranger, but someone who had carried a secret for too long. In a small cafe, she opened a leather bag and took out a stack of old files. "I researched Operation Mercy 10 years ago," she said, "and was told to stop. Some records were sealed and people were watching. I know how you feel." Clara tightened her grip on the coffee cup. "Why do they want to hide it?" Evelyn opened a photograph, a group of American soldiers beside a truck loaded with children, because some of the people in this photo are ancestors of politicians currently in power in Maine. Operation Mercy saved hundreds of Jewish children, but it was erased from the record because of an incident. A traitorous officer with ties to the Germans was executed right here in that very cellar. The air grew thick, and that man, Clara asked softly, "He was the husband of the current heir to the coal conglomerate," Evelyn said bluntly. "He's the one threatening you." Clara leaned back in her chair, feeling like the room was spinning. "So what do we do now?" Evelyn opened a notebook and wrote each line like a military plan. Week 1, verify the identities of the children in the film. Week 2, contact the Holocaust Museum in Washington and the Canadian History Center. After that, a simultaneous release on both sides of the border. Clara looked at her, voice trembling. "What if they try to stop us? Then we don't stay silent." Silence is exactly what they need. For the next 2 weeks, they worked quietly. Evelyn stayed in the town, living in a small room at the St. Matthew Inn. Together they went everywhere from the old library to the local archives, meeting elderly people who had once heard about the house welded shut in 1946. Each time they told the story, another piece clicked into place. News about the two women digging up history began to spread. Some people stopped by out of curiosity and offered help. Others avoided them. Then something strange happened. Mrs. Margaret, the grocery store owner, brought 2 boxes of nails. "Tell me what you need. I was here that year. I remember the trucks." One by one, people began choosing not to stay silent. As if when the truth was rekindled, the town itself grew warmer. While Evelyn and Clara were sorting documents one night, her phone rang. On the screen, unknown caller. She looked at Clara and pressed the speaker. Nathan's voice came through cold. "You two are playing with fire." Evelyn answered without shaking. "We're not playing, we're cleaning up the ashes." In the warm gold glow of the desk lamp, Clara understood that this fight wasn't only for the children in the reels, but for Leo. So her son would grow up knowing that silence in the face of wrong is also a kind of guilt. 3 weeks later, the first article appeared. The headline on the front page of the New York Times read, "Single mother and historian unearth lost WWII rescue operation in Maine." From Washington to Toronto, television stations reported the story. Evelyn and Clara hadn't expected the old reels to ignite such a vast wave of memory.